They watched the American bombers approach through broken clouds over the Reich, and the Luftwaffe pilots smiled inside their oxygen masks. The formations looked absurd. Instead of the sensible, scattered approach British bombers used at night, the Americans flew in tight geometric patterns, boxes stacked upon boxes, each bomber locked into position as if glued to invisible rails in the sky. To experienced German fighter pilots in the autumn of 1942, this represented not tactical innovation, but tactical suicide. Concentrating bombers made them easier to find, easier to track, and easier to destroy. The Americans were delivering their aircraft to German guns like cattle walking into a slaughterhouse. Hauptmann Wilhelm Süss, a veteran with 17 confirmed bomber kills, later told interrogators that his first thought upon seeing the American combat box formation over northern France was that someone in the United States Army Air Forces had fundamentally misunderstood aerial warfare. He had spent 2 years shooting down British bombers, picking off stragglers, attacking isolated aircraft, exploiting the darkness that protected individual bombers but also isolated them from mutual support. The Americans flew in daylight, packed together, visible for miles. It seemed like hubris born from inexperience, the kind of mistake that would be corrected after a few brutal lessons over defended German airspace. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Other German pilots shared this assessment. Fighter squadrons stationed in France and the Low Countries received intelligence briefings on American daylight bombing tactics with a mixture of anticipation and disbelief. The briefings detailed how American B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators would fly in formations of 18 to 21 aircraft, arranged in precise geometric boxes. Each box positioned bombers at different altitudes in a 3-dimensional arrangement. Multiple boxes would combine into larger formations called combat wings. 3 combat wings flying together created a bomber stream that might stretch across miles of sky. To Luftwaffe tacticians trained in the principles of dispersal and maneuver, this represented everything aerial combat doctrine said not to do. Concentrated formations created concentrated targets. They reduced the bomber's ability to take evasive action. They forced aircraft to maintain rigid positions regardless of damage or mechanical problems. The Americans were sacrificing flexibility. For what? The Germans were about to discover the answer, and it would fundamentally change their understanding of defensive firepower. The morning of August 17, 1942, marked the first American heavy bomber mission against occupied Europe. 12 B-17E bombers from the 97th Bomb Group attacked the marshalling yards at Rouen-Sotteville in France. The mission proceeded without fighter opposition, protected by Royal Air Force Spitfires throughout the flight. German fighters remained grounded, conserving strength for missions against less protected targets. The Americans returned, claiming success, having dropped 18.5 tons of bombs from an altitude of 23,000 feet. No aircraft were lost. No crew members were wounded. This initial success reinforced American confidence in daylight precision bombing. It also provided the Germans with their first glimpse of how American bombers flew and fought, though the lack of combat engagement meant crucial lessons remained unlearned on both sides. The Americans believed their defensive armament and tight formations would protect them. The Germans believed their fighter tactics developed against British bombers would work equally well against Americans. Both were partially right and dangerously wrong. The collision between these beliefs would begin in earnest when bomber formations flew beyond fighter escort range into defended German airspace, and German fighter pilots discovered what 750 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously actually meant. The combat box formation was not an accident of military planning. It emerged from careful analysis of defensive firepower, bomber vulnerability, and the mathematics of mutual support. The concept originated with Colonel Curtis LeMay, who would later become famous for his leadership of the strategic bombing campaign against Japan. In 1942, LeMay was a colonel commanding the 305th Bomb Group, and he was obsessed with keeping his crews alive. LeMay had studied the problem methodically. A single B-17 Flying Fortress carried 1350 caliber Browning M2 machine guns distributed across multiple positions. The aircraft had gun positions in the nose, top turret, ball turret beneath the fuselage, 2 waist positions, tail position, and cheek positions added to later models. Each position covered specific fields of fire. The nose guns protected the forward hemisphere. The top turret covered above and to the sides. The ball turret protected below. The waist gunners covered the beam positions. The tail gunner protected the rear. The cheek guns added forward firepower. This armament was formidable for a single bomber, but it had critical limitations. A fighter attacking from certain angles might face only 1 or 2 guns. The ball turret gunner could not engage targets directly behind the tail. The tail gunner could not engage targets approaching from directly below. Waist gunners had limited fields of fire toward the nose. Every bomber had blind spots where attacking fighters faced minimal defensive fire. LeMay recognized that if bombers flew close enough together in a carefully arranged formation, their defensive fire would overlap. A fighter attacking one bomber would be engaged not just by that aircraft's guns, but by guns from neighboring bombers whose fields of fire intersected the fighter's attack path. The key was positioning bombers so their defensive zones overlapped without creating collision hazards or turbulence that would make accurate bombing impossible. The standard combat box that emerged from LeMay's analysis and subsequent refinements arranged 18 to 21 bombers in a 3-dimensional formation. The lead squadron flew at the base altitude. A high squadron flew above and behind, typically positioned 1,000 feet higher and slightly to the right. A low squadron flew below and behind, typically 1,000 feet lower and slightly to the left. Within each squadron, bombers flew in precise positions relative to each other, creating a staggered formation that maximized overlapping fields of fire. The mathematics of this arrangement were elegant. An 18-bomber combat box positioned correctly created overlapping defensive fire covering virtually every approach angle. A fighter attempting to attack from 12 o'clock high, coming down from above and ahead, would be engaged by nose guns from the lead aircraft, top turret guns from multiple bombers, and potentially waist guns from aircraft in the high squadron. A fighter attacking from 6 o'clock level, approaching from directly behind, would face tail guns from every bomber in its path, plus waist guns from aircraft positioned to the sides. The theoretical defensive firepower was staggering. 18 B-17G model bombers, each carrying 1350 caliber machine guns, represented 234 individual weapons. Not all guns could engage any single target, but even conservative estimates suggested that a fighter approaching the formation from most angles would face fire from 40 to 60 guns simultaneously. Later models and larger formations increased these numbers substantially. German fighter pilots in 1942 had developed their tactics, fighting an entirely different kind of opponent. Royal Air Force Bomber Command conducted strategic bombing at night, sending individual aircraft or small streams of bombers over German cities protected by darkness and dispersal. German night fighters hunted these bombers individually, using radar guidance to position behind isolated targets, closing to range where their cannons could inflict fatal damage without warning. Against the few daylight raids the British attempted, German fighters had developed straightforward tactics: locate the bomber stream, identify stragglers or damaged aircraft, attack from advantageous positions, break away, repeat. German fighters carried heavy armament specifically designed for bomber destruction. The Messerschmitt Bf 109F and G models, mounted one 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and two 13mm machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc. Some variants mounted additional 20mm cannons in underwing pods. The Focke-Wulf Foe 190A carried four 20mm cannons and two 13mm machine guns. This armament reflected German tactical philosophy: close to within effective range, deliver a concentrated burst of cannon and machine gun fire, destroy the bomber's critical systems or kill crew members, break away before defensive fire became effective. German pilots trained to aim for engines, fuel tanks, cockpits, and control surfaces. A 2 to 3 second burst from a Favu 190's guns, properly aimed, would saw a bomber's wing off or set its fuel tanks ablaze. The tactics worked because British bombers were vulnerable. The Avro Lancaster carried 8 7.7mm machine guns in 3 turrets, far less firepower than American bombers. The Handley Page Halifax had similar defensive armament. Wellington bombers were even more lightly armed. British bombers relied on darkness, electronic countermeasures, and sheer numbers to survive. Individual aircraft that German night fighters caught were doomed. Even in daylight, British bombers lacked the defensive firepower to seriously threaten attacking fighters. German pilots had learned to respect British bomber defensive fire, but not to fear it. The 7.7mm rounds from British machine guns could damage aircraft and wound pilots, but they lacked the penetrating power and destructive effect of heavier weapons. A German fighter could sustain multiple hits from British defensive fire and return to base. Armor plate protected pilots and critical systems from most angles. Self-sealing fuel tanks prevented catastrophic fires from tracer rounds. When intelligence briefings detailed American bomber defenses, German pilots noted the heavier armament, but did not fundamentally revise their tactical approach. 50 caliber machine guns were certainly more dangerous than 7.7mm weapons, but the basic principles remained the same. Close rapidly to minimize exposure time, attack from advantageous angles, deliver maximum firepower in minimum time, break away before the bomber gunners could respond effectively. Luftwaffe fighter commanders developed standard attack profiles against bomber formations based on their experience. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high exploited the bombers' relative lack of forward firepower and allowed fighters to use their superior speed to close and break away quickly. Attacks from below took advantage of the ball turret's limited field of fire. Attacks from behind allowed fighters to match the bomber's speed and deliver sustained fire, though this exposed the fighter to tailgun fire. These tactics assumed that bomber defensive fire, while dangerous, was a manageable risk. A well-executed attack by a skilled pilot should destroy the bomber before its defensive guns inflicted significant damage on the fighter. Multiple fighters attacking simultaneously from different angles would overwhelm the bomber's ability to defend itself. The mathematics favored the attacker. What German pilots had not encountered was defensive fire from not one bomber but from 20 bombers simultaneously. They were about to learn what concentrated defensive firepower actually meant in practice. The Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress that German pilots would encounter over the Reich was a far more sophisticated weapons platform than anything they had faced before. The G model, which entered service in late 1942 and became the predominant variant, represented the culmination of years of development focused specifically on survivability in defended airspace. Each B-17G carried a crew of 10 men. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in the cockpit, with the bombardier and navigator in the nose compartment below them. The flight engineer manned the top turret directly behind the pilots. The radio operator worked in the radio room behind the bomb bay. The ball turret gunner operated from a cramped spherical turret beneath the fuselage. 2 waist gunners stood at window positions on opposite sides of the rear fuselage. The tail gunner occupied the most isolated position, alone in the tail section, separated from the rest of the crew. The defensive armament consisted of 13 Browning M250 caliber machine guns, positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire across all approach angles. The nose compartment contained 2 guns, one mounted on the right side operated by the bombardier, and one on the left side operated by the navigator in later models. Earlier variants had single manually aimed guns in flexible mounts. Later, G models added chin turrets with twin 50 caliber guns controlled by the bombardier, specifically to counter head-on fighter attacks. The top turret mounted 2 50 caliber guns in a powered turret that could rotate 360 degrees and elevate to engage targets above and to the sides of the aircraft. The flight engineer who operated this position had arguably the best field of view of any crew member and could engage fighters attacking from most angles, except directly below or directly behind. The ball turret represented perhaps the most remarkable defensive position. A Sperry ball turret was a sphere approximately 4 feet in diameter that hung beneath the fuselage, powered by electric motors that allowed it to rotate and elevate independently. The gunner sat in a fetal position with his knees drawn up, feet in stirrups, controlling 2 50 caliber guns that could engage targets approaching from below and to the sides. The ball turret covered the aircraft's most vulnerable zone, the belly, where fuel tanks and bomb bays made it impossible to install armor protection. The 2 waist positions each mounted a single 50 caliber gun on a flexible mount. Waist gunners stood at open windows, exposed to the freezing air at altitude, manually aiming their weapons at fighters, attacking from the beam positions. Early models had waist guns directly opposite each other, but this created problems when both gunners tried to engage the same target and collided with each other. Later models staggered the positions, placing them at different locations along the fuselage to provide better fields of fire and prevent gunner interference. The tail position mounted 2 50 caliber guns in a manually operated turret. The tail gunner sat facing backward, protected by armor plate, with a reflector sight for aiming. This position was critical for defending against the most common fighter attack profile, the stern approach where fighters would try to match the bomber's speed and deliver sustained fire into the rear fuselage and tail section. Each 50 caliber machine gun was fed by ammunition belts containing a mixture of ball, armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds. The standard load mixed 1 tracer round for every 5 rounds of other types, allowing gunners to see where their fire was going and adjust their aim. The armor-piercing rounds used tungsten carbide cores to penetrate aircraft armor. The incendiary rounds contained chemicals that ignited on impact, potentially starting fires in fuel systems or hydraulic lines. The theoretical rate of fire for a Browning M2 was between 750 and 850 rounds per minute, though practical firing rates were lower due to the need to fire in bursts to prevent overheating and to conserve ammunition. Each gun position carried between 300 and 500 rounds, depending on location and model variant. This meant that even with disciplined fire control, gunners could exhaust their ammunition in sustained combat lasting more than a few minutes. The combat box formation multiplied this individual defensive capability. When 18 B-17G models flew in proper formation, they represented 234 50 caliber machine guns. When German fighters approached, they did not face the 13 guns of a single bomber. They faced overlapping fire from multiple bombers, whose gunners could all track and engage the same target simultaneously. The collision between German tactical assumptions and American defensive firepower began in earnest during the missions of autumn 1942 and intensified through the spring and summer of 1943. The German fighter pilots who survived these encounters described experiences that fundamentally challenged everything they understood about bomber combat. Oberleutnant Heinz Noack, a Bf 109 pilot with Jagdgeschwader 11, recorded his first engagement with American combat boxes in his diary. On a mission in April 1943, his squadron intercepted a formation of B-17s over northwestern Germany. Noak described his approach from the ideal attack position, 12 o'clock high, diving toward the lead bomber with his cannons armed. At approximately 800 meters, he opened fire, expecting to see his rounds impact the bomber's cockpit and nose section. Instead, he saw tracer fire coming toward him from what seemed like every direction. The lead bomber's nose guns engaged him. The top turrets from bombers in the formation all swiveled toward his approach vector. He counted at least 6 separate streams of tracer fire converging on his position. The sound of rounds hitting his aircraft was like hail on a metal roof. His windscreen cracked. A round penetrated his engine cowling. Another struck his wing, punching a hole through the thin metal. Noak broke off his attack without achieving any damage to his target. He later wrote that the volume of defensive fire was unlike anything he had experienced against British bombers. It was not that individual American gunners were more accurate or more aggressive. It was that there were so many of them, all firing simultaneously, creating what he described as a wall of metal that was impossible to fly through without taking multiple hits. Other German pilots reported similar experiences. Hauptmann Heinz Baer, who would end the war as one of Germany's highest-scoring fighter aces with 220 confirmed victories, described attacking American formations as flying into a storm of steel. He noted that against British bombers, a fighter pilot could usually identify where defensive fire was coming from and maneuver to avoid the most dangerous zones. Against American combat boxes, fire came from so many simultaneous positions that evasive maneuvering became almost impossible. The only option was to bore straight through the defensive fire, deliver your attack, and hope you survived long enough to break away. The mathematical reality was brutal. A German fighter approaching an American combat box from most angles faced fire from approximately 40 to 60 .50 caliber machine guns simultaneously. Each gun fired between 750 and 850 rounds per minute. Even accounting for the difficulties of aiming from moving platforms and the relatively low probability of hitting a fast-moving target, the sheer volume of fire meant that any fighter within range for more than a few seconds would sustain multiple hits. German pilots adapted their tactics in response. Head-on attacks from 12 o'clock high became the preferred method despite the danger because they minimized exposure time. A fighter diving at the formation at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles per hour would be within range of defensive fire for only a few seconds. The disadvantage was that this gave the pilot very little time to aim and fire effectively. Most head-on attacks failed to destroy their targets, though they might inflict damage and certainly disrupted bombing accuracy as pilots took evasive action. Some German pilots tried attacking from below, hoping to exploit the limited field of fire of the ball turret. They discovered that ball turret gunners were remarkably effective at tracking and engaging targets beneath the formation. The Sperry ball turret could rotate and elevate smoothly, giving the gunner excellent visibility and fire control. Multiple ball turrets, engaging a fighter from different bombers in the formation, created overlapping fire zones that were nearly impossible to penetrate. Attacks from behind, the classic stern chase, became suicide missions against American formations. The tail gunners from every bomber in the formation could engage targets approaching from 6 o'clock. A fighter trying to match the bomber's speed and deliver sustained fire would face fire from 20 or more tail guns simultaneously. The closing speed was low, giving gunners plenty of time to track and engage. German pilots who attempted stern attacks reported sustaining so much damage that continuing the attack became impossible. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Luftwaffe units began tracking the effectiveness of their attacks against American formations with increasing concern. Mission reports from fighter squadrons showed that it now took an average of 20 cannon rounds to destroy a B-17, compared to 10 to 15 rounds for British bombers. Fighter pilots were expending all their ammunition against American formations and achieving far fewer kills. Worse, German fighter losses were increasing. Pilots who survived being hit by 50 caliber fire described the devastating effect of the large rounds. Unlike the 7.7mm rounds from British guns, which might damage control surfaces or wound crew members, 50 caliber rounds could destroy critical aircraft systems with single hits. The full implications of American defensive firepower became undeniable during the mission to Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, a date that would become known as Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force dispatched 291 B-17s to attack ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt, deep in southern Germany beyond the range of escort fighters. The bombers would fly the final 200 miles to target and back without fighter protection, relying entirely on their formation defensive fire to survive. German fighter controllers recognized the opportunity. Without escort fighters, the American formations would be vulnerable to sustained attack by massed German fighters. Luftwaffe units from across Germany were ordered to intercept. Approximately 300 German fighters from multiple Jagdgeschwader assembled to attack the bomber stream. This would be the largest coordinated German fighter effort against American daylight bombers to date. The German pilots expected significant losses among the bombers. Intelligence estimates suggested that concentrated attacks by 300 fighters against unescorted bomber formations should result in catastrophic American losses, perhaps destroying half the attacking force. The mathematics seemed straightforward. 300 fighters, each making multiple attack passes, should overwhelm the defensive fire from even the tightest formations. The reality proved far more complex and costly than German planners anticipated. The American formations maintained their combat boxes throughout the mission despite mechanical problems, battle damage, and mounting casualties. When German fighters attacked, they encountered the full weight of concentrated defensive fire that intelligence briefings had described, but that many pilots had not fully experienced until this mission. Unteroffizier Walter Hagener, flying a Bf-109 G6 with Jagdgeschwader 1, described attacking a combat box from the beam position, coming in from the side at a slight diving angle. He opened fire at 600 meters, seeing his cannon rounds impact the wing of a B-17 in the low squadron. Return fire from the formation was immediate and overwhelming. He counted tracer streams from at least 10 different bombers converging on his position. Rounds struck his wing, his fuselage, his canopy. A 50 caliber round hit his instrument panel, destroying his airspeed indicator and attitude gyro. Another round struck his propeller blade, sending violent vibrations through the entire aircraft. Hagener broke off his attack and dove away, his aircraft badly damaged. He made it back to his base, but the fighter required extensive repairs. He had achieved one damaged bomber in exchange for his aircraft being temporarily removed from service. He told his commanding officer that continuing to attack such formations would require either different tactics or acceptance of unsustainable loss rates among German fighters. Other pilots reported similar experiences. The combat boxes maintained their integrity even as individual bombers sustained damage and fell out of formation. As long as the formations held together, their defensive fire remained devastating. German pilots found themselves forced to choose between pressing attacks through intense defensive fire, likely resulting in their own aircraft being hit, or breaking off attacks prematurely, which meant failing to destroy their targets. The mission results demonstrated the terrible mathematics of attrition warfare. The Americans lost 60 B-17s that day, 20% of the attacking force. Another 17 bombers were so badly damaged they would never fly combat missions again. Over 600 American airmen were killed, wounded, or captured. By any measure, it was a catastrophic loss. But German fighters also paid a heavy price. The Luftwaffe lost 38 fighters destroyed and another 20 damaged beyond immediate repair. 17 fighter pilots were killed and 12 wounded. The loss rate among German fighters, 13% destroyed, was lower than the American bomber loss rate, but it represented a significant erosion of experienced pilots and scarce aircraft that Germany could not easily replace. More significantly, the mission demonstrated that American combat boxes, even without fighter escort, could not be destroyed at acceptable cost to German fighter forces. The defensive firepower was simply too concentrated. To inflict catastrophic losses on bomber formations required committing large numbers of fighters to sustained attacks, which resulted in unacceptable German losses. The arithmetic of attrition did not favor Germany, which had smaller pilot training programs and more limited industrial capacity than the United States. Black Thursday marked a turning point in German tactical thinking. The easy victories some pilots had anticipated against American daylight bombers had not materialized. Instead, attacking American formations had become one of the most dangerous missions Luftwaffe fighter pilots could fly. The defensive firepower that American planners had built into their combat box formations was working exactly as designed, making attacks costly enough to deter all but the most determined or desperate German fighter pilots. The lessons of Black Thursday and dozens of similar missions forced fundamental changes in Luftwaffe fighter tactics against American daylight bombers. German fighter commanders recognized that their pre-war doctrine, developed against lightly defended British bombers, was inadequate for the combat reality they now faced. The defensive firepower of American combat boxes demanded new approaches that acknowledged the mathematical reality of concentrated 50 caliber machine gun fire. German fighter units began developing specialized attack formations specifically designed to overwhelm bomber defensive fire through coordination rather than individual heroics. The concept was simple, but difficult to execute. Multiple fighters would attack the same combat box simultaneously from different angles, forcing American gunners to divide their attention and fire across multiple targets. A coordinated attack from 12 o'clock high, 3 o'clock level, and 6 o'clock low simultaneously should, in theory, allow at least some fighters to press their attacks without facing the full concentration of defensive fire. Jagdgeschwader commanders drilled their pilots in these coordinated tactics during training periods between combat missions. The attacks required precise timing and communication. Fighters approaching from different vectors needed to arrive at firing range within seconds of each other. Radio discipline was critical. Attack leaders needed to coordinate the approach, signal the attack, and manage the breakaway without confusion that might cause mid-air collisions between friendly aircraft. In practice, these coordinated attacks achieved mixed results. When executed properly by experienced pilots, they could overwhelm a combat box's defensive fire and achieve multiple bomber kills in a single pass. During a mission over Brunswick in February 1944, a coordinated attack by fighters from Jagdgeschwader 11 destroyed 4 B-17s from a single combat box in less than 3 minutes. The simultaneous attacks from multiple angles prevented gunners from concentrating their fire effectively, allowing German pilots to press close and deliver accurate cannon fire. But such perfectly executed attacks were rare. Combat conditions over Germany in 1944 made coordination difficult. American fighter escorts, particularly the long-range P-51 Mustangs that began arriving in large numbers, disrupted German attack formations before they could execute their coordinated strikes. Weather obscured visual contact between German fighters trying to coordinate their approaches. Damaged aircraft fell out of formation, breaking the timing required for simultaneous attacks. German pilots also developed heavier armament specifically for bomber destruction, attempting to solve the problem through firepower rather than tactics alone. The Bf-109 G6 received underwing pods mounting additional 20mm or 30mm cannons. Some variants carried a single 30mm cannon firing through the propeller hub, capable of destroying a bomber with just a few hits. The WWII-190A8 mounted up to 6 20mm or 30mm cannons in various configurations. This heavy armament came with significant penalties. The additional weight and drag reduced fighter performance, making the aircraft slower and less maneuverable. This made them more vulnerable to American escort fighters and reduced their ability to execute the high-speed diving attacks that minimized exposure to bomber defensive fire. A full U-190A8 with full armament might carry enough firepower to destroy multiple bombers, but it had to survive long enough to get within range, and the concentrated defensive fire from combat boxes made survival increasingly difficult. Some Luftwaffe units experimented with even more radical solutions. The Fu-190A8 Sturmbock variant carried heavy armor protection for the pilot and critical systems, accepting the performance penalties in exchange for the ability to press attacks through defensive fire. Pilots flying Sturmbock aircraft were expected to close to point-blank range within 200 meters or less, where their heavy cannons could not miss, and where defensive fire, while certain to hit, might be defeated by armor protection. These armored fighters achieved some success in specialized anti-bomber units like Sturmstaffel 1, but they represented desperate measures acknowledging that standard fighter tactics were inadequate. The fact that Luftwaffe commanders felt compelled to armor their fighters and instruct pilots to close to suicidal ranges demonstrated how thoroughly American defensive firepower had disrupted German tactical doctrine. Despite all these adaptations, the fundamental problem remained unsolved. American combat boxes flying in proper formation generated defensive firepower that made attacks costly regardless of German tactics or armament. The introduction of long-range American escort fighters in late 1943 and early 1944 made the situation even worse for German defenders. Now Luftwaffe fighters had to fight through American escorts before they could even attempt attacks against the bomber formations, and they faced the same escorts again during their breakaway after attacking bombers. The effectiveness of American combat box defensive firepower had consequences that extended far beyond individual air battles. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany depended on the ability to conduct daylight precision bombing missions deep into German territory. If German fighters could destroy American bomber formations at acceptable cost, the entire daylight bombing strategy would become unsustainable. The defensive firepower built into the combat box formations made daylight strategic bombing possible. American losses remained substantial throughout 1944. No defensive formation, no matter how well designed, could eliminate losses against a determined enemy with numerical superiority in his own airspace. Bomber crews faced 25 mission combat tours with loss rates that meant many would not survive. The 8th Air Force in Europe lost over 4,000 B-17s during the war, with approximately 47,000 aircrew killed, wounded, or captured. But these losses, while terrible for the individuals involved, were sustainable for American strategic purposes. The United States' industrial capacity replaced lost bombers faster than German fighters could destroy them. American training programs graduated new aircrew in numbers that more than compensated for combat casualties. Boeing, Douglas, and other manufacturers built B-17s and B-24s in quantities that seemed impossible by European standards. American factories delivered over 12,700 B-17s and over 18,000 B-24s during the war. Germany could not match this industrial output. Luftwaffe fighter losses over the Reich mounted steadily through 1944 as the air war intensified. Experienced pilots were killed faster than training programs could replace them. Aircraft production, while impressive given Germany's increasingly constrained resources, could not keep pace with attrition rates against both American daylight bombers and Royal Air Force night bombers. The mathematics of attrition warfare favored the side with greater industrial capacity and larger pilot training programs. American combat boxes made German attacks costly enough that Germany's smaller industrial base could not sustain the required loss rates indefinitely. Each mission over Germany eroded Luftwaffe fighter strength, while American bomber strength continued growing. German fighter pilots who survived the air battles of 1944 faced a grinding war of attrition they could not win. Oberleutnant Heinz Snoke, whose first encounter with American defensive firepower had shocked him in April 1943, continued flying combat missions through 1944. His diary entries documented the steady erosion of Luftwaffe fighter strength. Squadrons that once fielded 30 or 40 aircraft struggled to launch a dozen. Replacement pilots arrived with inadequate training, sometimes with less than 200 hours total flight time, and were killed on their first or second missions. Fuel shortages limited training flights, creating a vicious cycle where new pilots entered combat unprepared and died quickly. Noak described the psychological burden of watching American bomber streams pass overhead in formations so large they darkened the sky. The combat boxes flew in such numbers that attacking them all became impossible. German fighters would destroy a dozen bombers from one formation, while 3 other formations proceeded unmolested to their targets. The defensive firepower of individual combat boxes meant that even when German fighters achieved local numerical superiority, pressing attacks home resulted in unacceptable losses. By late 1944, German fighter defense against American daylight bombers had essentially collapsed. The introduction of the Me-262 jet fighter provided brief technological superiority, but too few were built to affect the strategic situation. American bombers roamed over Germany with relative impunity, attacking industrial targets, transportation networks, and fuel production facilities. The defensive firepower that American planners had built into their combat box formations had achieved its purpose, making daylight strategic bombing sustainable despite fierce German resistance. The irony that German pilots faced was profound. They had begun the war as the most experienced fighter force in the world, victorious in Poland, France, and the early phases of the Eastern Front. They had developed tactics and equipment that made them dominant in air-to-air combat. They were confident, skilled, and aggressive. Then they encountered American combat boxes and discovered that all their experience, all their tactical sophistication, all their courage meant nothing when mathematics and industrial capacity determined the outcome. A single B-17 with 1350 caliber machine guns was a formidable opponent. 18 B-17s, flying in a combat box with overlapping fields of fire, were nearly invulnerable to conventional fighter attack. 3 combat wings flying together, 54 bombers with over 700 machine guns, created defensive firepower that no fighter force could penetrate without catastrophic losses. German pilots had mocked the rigid American formations as tactical stupidity. They learned through bitter experience that the formations represented tactical sophistication they had not anticipated and could not overcome. The story of German fighter pilots confronting American combat box defensive firepower represents more than just a tactical evolution in aerial warfare. It demonstrates how industrial capacity and systematic engineering could overcome individual skill and tactical flexibility in modern warfare. The Luftwaffe pilots who attacked American bomber formations were not inferior warriors. They were experienced, skilled, aggressive, and often flying technically superior aircraft. But they faced a system designed to neutralize their advantages through mathematics and mass production. The combat box formation reflected distinctly American approaches to warfare. Where European military traditions emphasized individual prowess, tactical flexibility, and operational artistry, American military doctrine emphasized systematic solutions, overwhelming material superiority, and engineering approaches to tactical problems. The combat box was an engineered solution to the problem of bomber vulnerability. It treated defensive firepower as a mathematical problem that could be solved through proper positioning and concentrated fire. This approach characterized American military operations throughout World War II. When faced with tactical challenges, American commanders sought systematic solutions that could be mass-produced and implemented across large formations. The combat box formation could be taught to any bomb group through standardized training. It did not require exceptional individual skill or tactical genius. It required discipline, formation, flying ability, and adherence to standardized procedures. These were capabilities that American training programs could produce in quantity. The German approach, emphasizing individual fighter pilot skill and tactical flexibility, worked brilliantly when German pilots held qualitative advantages in training, experience, and often aircraft performance. But it could not scale to match American industrial output. Training exceptional fighter pilots required years and could not be rushed without compromising quality. Producing enough exceptional pilots to attack bomber formations numbering in the hundreds required training infrastructure and time that Germany did not have. The .50 caliber machine gun itself represented American industrial and engineering philosophy. It was not the lightest weapon, not the fastest firing, not the most technologically sophisticated, but it was reliable, powerful enough to be effective against a wide range of targets, and could be mass-produced in quantities that seemed impossible to other nations. American factories built over 3 million Browning M250 caliber machine guns during the war. They equipped aircraft, vehicles, ships, and ground fortifications. The weapon was everywhere in American armed forces, creating a standardized armament that simplified logistics and training. When those weapons were concentrated in combat box formations, they generated defensive firepower that changed the nature of aerial warfare over Europe. German fighter pilots had to choose between accepting unsustainable losses or conceding control of German airspace to American bombers. Neither choice led to German victory. The defensive firepower was simply too great to overcome without losses that Germany's smaller industrial base could not sustain. For the American aircrew who flew in those combat boxes, the experience was terrifying despite the defensive protection their formations provided. They watched fighters attack through curtains of defensive fire. They saw neighboring bombers explode or fall out of formation with engines on fire. They knew that a single cannon round could end their lives regardless of how many machine guns protected their formation. The combat box made survival more likely, but it did not make survival certain. The bomber crews who completed their 25 mission tours and went home had survived an ordeal that killed or captured nearly half of the men who flew with the 8th Air Force. They had faith in their defensive formations, in the overlapping fields of fire that their training emphasized, in the mathematics that said concentrated defensive fire should protect them. But they also knew that mathematics were not magic, that German cannon rounds did not respect statistical probabilities, that courage and training and proper formation flying increased survival chances without guaranteeing survival. The German pilots who survived the war and were later interviewed by historians described the American combat boxes with mixture of respect and frustration. They acknowledged the effectiveness of the defensive firepower. They recognized that American tactical doctrine had been better suited to the realities of daylight strategic bombing than their own doctrine had been to defending against it. But they also emphasized that individual courage, that tactical skill, that the human element of warfare mattered even when industrial capacity determined outcomes. Both sides were correct. The combat box defensive firepower worked because it was well designed, properly implemented, and backed by industrial capacity that could replace losses. But it worked because American aircrew maintained formation discipline under fire, because gunners tracked and engaged targets while their aircraft shook from defensive maneuvers, because pilots held position even when neighboring bombers exploded. The system worked because the men operating within it made it work through courage and competence. The lasting lesson from this chapter of the air war over Europe is not that technology or tactics or industrial capacity alone determines military outcomes. It is that modern industrial warfare requires all three working together within a coherent strategic framework. American combat boxes succeeded because they combined engineering, solutions, tactical implementation, industrial mass production, and individual courage into a system that achieved strategic objectives despite fierce opposition and terrible costs. When German pilots first saw American bomber formations and smiled at what seemed like tactical stupidity, they were making assumptions based on their experience against different opponents using different tactics. When they attacked those formations and encountered defensive firepower that damaged their aircraft and killed their comrades, they learned that assumptions based on past experience can be lethally wrong when facing an opponent with different capabilities and different approaches to warfare. The Americans who designed, flew, and fought in combat box formations demonstrated that systematic approaches to tactical problems, backed by industrial capacity and implemented with discipline and courage, could overcome individual superiority in skill or equipment. 750 caliber machine guns firing simultaneously from a single formation represented not just defensive firepower, but a philosophy of warfare that would characterize American military operations for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.